What is the most used man-made material on Earth? You guessed it, concrete. Look around, it's everywhere. Sidewalks, driveways, foundations, floors you stand on, and even entire buildings are made from concrete. So why don't we discuss it more? In each episode of Concrete Logic, we will explore one concrete-related topic with the help from industry professionals that are shaping the future of the trade. We'll talk with suppliers, contractors, architects, engineers, specialists, and even some proponents of competing materials about their views of concrete and their vision of its future. And welcome to another episode of the Concrete Logic Podcast. This is Seth Tandett, and today I got Paul Ramsburg with Sika. Paul, how are you doing today?
Good. How you doing, Seth?
Good. Can you give us a little introduction to you that don't know you? I think you're kind of famous on LinkedIn, so I feel like I know you already, but go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so I work for Sika Corporation as a district manager covering the Deep South, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. I've been in admixtures about 13 years, been in the concrete industry since I got out of school in the late 80s. Worked in production of concrete, most of my career in quality control, and most recently in admixture sales.
Cool. And we don't have to go too deep into your origin story, but did you go to school for concrete, or did concrete find you?
Concrete found me.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. That's not what I went to school for.
Yeah, I have the same story. I'm going to start asking people that, but I think that is more the norm than not.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are passionate about concrete, came to it that same way. They didn't intend to be there. They were passionate about something else, and ultimately latched onto it and found a home for their passion.
That's right. Yeah. Well, today Paul has agreed to come on and give us the history of concrete, and he's given this presentation a bunch of times, but hopefully today will be one of his favorite times, because we're going to make this a little bit fun for him. So, Paul, if you want to get started on it, and I guess you don't mind if I jump in and ask questions as we go along?
No, please do. Please do.
All right.
So what I want to get across is the history of concrete is intertwined with the history of human civilization. And there's no point in human civilization where we don't see some presence of concrete. And we like to think of certain cultures as developing it, but I really want to highlight how all of humanity had a hand in getting us to where we're at now. There's no more human building material than concrete, and that's what I want to focus on. But we'll start our story. We'll go way back to start our story, and we're going to go way back to the year 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. There's the oldest structure known to man right now. The oldest structure that we've unearthed is a site called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey currently. And this site was unearthed about 20 years ago. It's a lot of standing monoliths, tall stone structures built in circles. It's thousands of years older than Stonehenge, but similar in nature. But what we also find there is evidence of a concrete flooring system. So in the earliest evidence of human civilization, concrete's present. What's interesting about the site is there's carvings of domesticated animals on the stones, sheep and goats and pigs and cows. From 12,000 years ago, we did not think that the civilizations that domesticated those animals even knew each other existed. So this is revolutionizing how we think of early human civilization. And of course, whenever we unearth a structure like this, we always call it a temple. But prevailing knowledge now, we think maybe this is a research center or an education center. That at the end of the last ice age, there was a civilization bringing tribes and cultures of hunter-gatherers here, training them on domestication of animals, on farming techniques, giving them seeds, because there's evidence of seed banks on the site, giving them seeds, giving them animals, sending them back to their homelands to begin human agriculture. But what we then in turn see is at the dawn of human agriculture, we see the dawn of the concrete industry.
Yeah.
I think so. There's no time in human history where we don't see concrete present with people.
Yeah. I guess we always default to, when we think of human history, we go back that far. We thought I guess folks were dumber than us now.
Yeah.
It might have been the opposite. I think they might have been smarter than us.
Yeah, but it's interesting. So we have to define what is concrete. So this isn't, coarse and fine aggregate and admixtures and pozzolans and stuff. That's not there yet. Obviously, it's not Portland cement. But if we just define pozzolan of some type of cement, which this was quicklime, it's limestone burnt and burn off the carbon and you create a cement, and then sand and maybe some small pebbles and water, and that was the ingredients. But it did create a concrete that's still here 12,000 years later, so you can't discredit the material.
No submittals either.
That's
no
right. No one needed to submit a mix design. But what I think is super intriguing at the same time on Earth is tribes of Native Americans on the East Coast, so Southeast U.S. They have a burial ritual where when someone dies, they dig a pit in the ground, they put the body there, they put animal parts of animal carcasses like deer antlers and stuff in, they burn them, so they're cremated, but then they add burnt oyster shells. If you burn the carbon off an oyster shell, you have a cement material. And then they stir it all up in this hole and they let the rainwater solidify it. They invented concrete as a burial practice, but no one that we know of in North America, none of the native peoples ever thought to build anything out of it. They were just doing concrete plugs as a burial ritual, whereas we see here over in the Middle East, they kind of come to the same understanding of concrete, but started building things out of it.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, then after that site, there's another site discovered, which is about 2,000 years newer than that one, still thousands of years older than Stonehenge. But this one's called Navali Kori, and it's still in southeastern Turkey, what currently is Turkey. And it's built by Bedouins, by nomadic peoples that are roaming all through Asia Minor and the Middle East. They have no permanent houses, no permanent villages, right? They're living in tents and roaming around. They have two permanent structures that associated with the culture. They have cisterns for water, because you can travel through the desert only so far with the water you carry before you need to replenish your water. And they space them out through their desert travel paths. And they have cement kilns, because in order to have a cistern that's waterproof, you need a quicklime cement. So the only two permanent structures those Bedouins made for thousands of years are cement kilns and cisterns. What's interesting is they advertise their cisterns. They put them in public areas where anyone traveling would go there. So they're sharing the water source. But the cement kilns, they bury with rocks every time they're done using them. So they burn enough cement to make another cistern. Then they cover the cement kiln with rocks so no one can find it. So they're protecting a technology. They invented technology and they're protecting it so no other culture can understand it. So I think it's interesting. They're guarding something that they know how to do and they don't want other people to learn.
Huh.
But we still run into both the kilns and in the Middle East, when you dig up something in Syria or Jordan, they still run into these cisterns and kilns that are thousands of years old. And then there was a culture that stretched from the Danube Valley in Eastern Europe all the way down through to about Gaza. And this, you were talking about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, that built concrete flooring slabs for the housing system. You have thousands of these slabs found. They're about 8 foot square, about 3 inches thick, and they're laid out on a bed of compacted sand. And there's even wooden float marks in the surfaces. And based on what they find around them, they think they were flooring slabs where they built a wooden house over top of it. So you cast a concrete floor and build a wooden structure on it, small wooden hut. And thousands or hundreds of these for a few thousand years. And then about 5,000 years ago, they disappear. The culture that builds them just stops building them. And no one's building anything out of concrete. It's like the first concrete dark age since human civilization started. There's one of them found in Galilee. It's an interesting picture of a near perfect concrete slab that's 5,000-6,000 years old, sitting in Galilee.
Is there anything reinforcing it, or is it just pure concrete?
Just compacted concrete on a sand bed, but no reinforcement, none. So I think ultimately, why do some of these ancient structures survive and why some don't? It all depends on the plate tectonics. If an area is prone to earthquake, they don't survive. And some of these just got lucky enough they were in an area where they weren't toppled or cracked or destroyed by earthquakes. So we think of the concrete dark ages, but then that ends around 3000 BC. So we're not too far in the dark with concrete before the ancient Chinese discover our concrete material, start using it. And for hundreds of years, the Chinese built lintels, housing units, floor slabs. They even use cement mortar between stones on the Great Wall of China. So China becomes a very early adapter to concrete technology, and eventually it dies out and they stop using it. But around 3000 BC, they start. Now here's evidence. I always heard this rumor that the ancient Romans used to use pig's blood as an admixture. I don't know where that rumor is. There's no literature on it, and there's no writing from the ancient Romans that they ever did that. There's no evidence. But there is writing from the ancient Chinese that they used pig's blood and goat's milk as admixtures in their concrete and their masonry product. And why would they have done that? Well, it would have made the concrete stronger. Both would act like water reducers, and milk would have acted, because the lactose would have been a slight retarder, giving them more work time. Interestingly, and they wrote about it, but interestingly, they didn't write about its effects on air entrainment, because blood would entrain air in concrete. Which is why a lot of the early concrete structures from China, that 5,000 years old almost, they're still standing because they're air entrained, but it seems to be unintentional.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Wonder how long it took them to figure that out.
They had a lot of centuries to figure that. But eventually they stopped too, and delved into other building materials. Now back to the Middle East, it didn't show up again. So we're looking about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, concrete disappears as a material. Then about the year 1950 BC, so almost 4,000 years ago, the Egyptians start dabbling in cement and concrete. And it's quicklime cement still, but there's drawings on the walls of certain funerary structures in like Thebes, Egypt, that show the process for making cement, not just bricks, which they built a lot out of clay brick, but also making cement and concrete blocks to use in construction. Now, the pyramids likely have nothing to do with concrete, but there's plenty of other structures they built that were not pyramids and did have evidence of cement masonry construction. But that really launches it. So the Egyptians, in turn, hand their technology over to the Greeks. In that path, around the year 500 BC, the Phoenicians start making stuff out of concrete. The Phoenicians were a sea-bearing culture that lived, maybe where Gaza, North Africa is, and around the Middle East. They were a dominant culture, the Phoenicians, before the Greeks. What I think is interesting is they built a lot of, because they were ocean or Mediterranean voyaging people, they built a lot of piers out into the Mediterranean out of concrete. And so they can dock their boats or load them and unload them. But if we study the materials they built it out of, this is what's interesting, is the rock they used in their concrete, because they poured a lot like the Romans did. They laid out stone and then they put cement paste on top of it in layers. But the stone wasn't from the beach there. They weren't using pebbles or large rocks from that area. They were going 50 miles inland to pick rocks and crush them and bring them back and use them in construction. They don't say why they did it. They didn't write about it. But what can we learn by their selection? If they had used the rocks there by the saltwater, the limestone there was very reactive. So if they had a high alkali quicklime cement and reactive silica stone, they would have had ASR, and those concrete piers would have deteriorated in their lifetime and not still be there in our lifetime. So did they understand ASR? Not likely they understood exactly what it is. Did you understand there was a problem with some rocks in concrete and other rocks work better? Well, definitely, if they were traveling 50 miles inland to pick rocks for concrete. The other thing is interesting is they were the first culture to develop glass, especially glass as a building material, were the Phoenicians. And a byproduct of glass is slag. And they would powder their slag and blend it in with their quicklime cement. So we think of Romans as inventing pozzolan-based cement. The Phoenicians had ground granulated blast furnace slag blended into their quicklime cement, so they were using a pozzolan cement too. Another reason likely why they didn't have ASR or sulfate attack issues with their concrete. But we don't know that they understood any of that. They might have been doing it just to get rid of the waste byproduct, but it definitely worked for them.
And what's ASR?
Alkali silica reactivity. So it's a prominent issue with concrete in some area where the high alkalinity of cement interacts with reactive silica in certain aggregates, not all aggregates, just some, and they create a gel, an alkali silica gel within concrete after it's hardened, usually years after the concrete's in place. And when moisture reaches that gel, it expands and creates cracking and spalling, so it'll deteriorate concrete relatively quickly in the history of what we're talking about here.
Huh.
Yeah, we in the United States, we started focusing on ASR as a problem for our concrete in the 1970s. It looked like the Phoenicians figured out in 500 BC. So the Greeks did a little bit with concrete, not much. Greeks favored marble stacked stone construction, but they had a little bit of concrete technology. But through the Greeks, the concrete reaches Rome, and that's really where the industry takes off. The Rome and Empire builds a lot of things out of concrete. In fact, to be a Roman legion, to be a soldier, legionnaire, you had to know how to build out of concrete. That was a requirement for all Roman legionnaires to also be concrete masons, because they didn't just send their army to fight; they sent their army to build structures and forts and fortifications. It was part of being a soldier. You had to use a sword and you had to use a trowel. But we think about some of the things they figured out. We can look at a structure they built, the Pantheon in Rome. It's a very large structure. It's 2,000 years old, still there now. You and I could walk in and tour it, and it's as beautiful today as it was 2,000 years ago. But it's the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. And it's about 162 feet across. It has an oculus, a hole in the top, about 8 foot in diameter, and absolutely stunning concrete structure with a pattern on the inside of the dome. But I think that's our industry's mascot, is the Pantheon in Rome, because it's such a beautiful 2,000-year-old structure. But some of the other things that Romans worked with, they blended natural pigments with cement and then painted frescoes on concrete walls with cement and pigment. It's to create these kind of concrete paintings, and that's how they decorated the interior, a lot of their palaces. Interestingly, the artist that was most well known for these elaborate decorations of painted concrete, his name in Latin was Fabulous, and we still use his name to describe things that are over the top and beautiful, fabulous, and that's a reference to a guy who worked in cement.
Oh, that's funny.
Of course, Romans come up with waterproof concrete. Most of the aqueducts were stacked stone, but the very top of the aqueduct, where the water traveled through, was waterproof concrete, and they wrote manuals on how to create waterproof concrete. There's an excellent aqueduct in Segovia, Spain, built by the ancient Romans, and it delivered water to the town of Segovia from the mountains until the 1960s. That was the city's only water supply, was this almost 2,000-year-old aqueduct that was waterproof concrete. And the only reason they stopped using it in the 60s is the city had this population boom, and it couldn't bring enough water to support the whole city, so they had to start digging wells and building reservoirs. I think it's interesting that it lasted that long.
Yeah. Would they use to waterproof the concrete?
So here's a technology they use. It was pozzolans, basically. So if the listeners aren't familiar with the word pozzolan, this would refer to something like a fly ash or a slag or silica fume these other supplementary cementitious materials. And the word pozzolan comes from the ancient Romans. In fact, the city of Pozzuoli is what that word comes from. Pozzuoli is at the base of Mount Vesuvius. Of course, Vesuvius had been erupting long before it destroyed Pompeii, but they quarried a lot of ash from Vesuvius. It was a pozzolanic material. They'd mix it in with their cement, and then it would create a very dense concrete. But they found if they mixed salt water in instead of fresh water with their concrete, the salt water would in turn encourage mineral growth through the capillary system of the concrete, and it would close off those capillaries completely. So their concrete wasn't waterproof on at the 7-day break or the 28-day break. Not that they did this, but a year or 2 years in, the concrete is completely waterproof. It worked a lot like crystalline waterproofers do today. But and no reason not to use salt water in concrete if there's no reinforcement there to corrode.
Right.
That is it's a secret of the longevity of Roman concrete was the use of salt water to encourage that mineral growth. But my favorite person from ancient Rome is Marcus Vitruvius Pollio. We just call him Vitruvius. About 15 BC, he writes the oldest known architectural manual in existence. It's a 10-part book called De Architectura, and he basically pins down what the Romans know about concrete. He writes in there in the very beginning. Book 2 is all about concrete. I had the chance to sit at the Pantheon. I went to Rome with my wife, and every morning I get up early. I went to the Pantheon, sat on the steps, and read a translation of De Architectura, Book 2 about Roman concrete construction. It was a religious experience for me.
Oh yeah.
In the beginning of the book, he describes what concrete structure should be. In Latin, firmitas, utilitas, venustas. That means strong, firmitas, utilitas, useful, venustas, beautiful. Strong, useful, and beautiful. And architects today still live by that. A concrete structure should be those things. Here's my favorite thing he writes in the book. He's talking about interacting with the customer. And he says, may the architect be high-minded, not arrogant, but faithful, just and easy to deal with. And it makes me think he did a lot of mock-ups with architects.
That should be somebody's slogan, an architecture firm.
Yeah, shouldn't it? In there, he also explains the importance of retaining moisture to avoid shrinkage cracking. We think of shrinkage cracking now. I get so many concrete producers come to me about, hey, I never had shrinkage cracking before. What is this? How do I work with it? 2,000 years ago, we had a manual telling us to, wet cure our concrete.
Wet cure.
Shrinkage cracking. We've known that for 2 millennia. It's not new.
That's a lot of the stuff we use now. We've been using for a long time, and everybody acts like it's something new.
Yeah, but that's why I like this history of concrete presentation, is that it really focuses on back to basics and where we started developing some of the basics that we know in the industry. And it's not a new technology by any means. But Vitruvius also explains in there the importance of aggregate cleanliness. He actually gives us a standard. Now we have ASTM C33 to define the fitness of a sand for use in concrete. He actually lays out a test method where you take a white linen cloth and you put a handful of sand on it, shake it around, and then shake it out. And if there's any color retention on the cloth, then the sand's no good for concrete. And we think about, what is he measuring? He's measuring clay silt, and he's measuring organic impurities. And we do clay silt and organic impurities tests now in our laboratories, but he come up with a practical test in his day of how to determine whether a sand should be used in concrete or not.
Yeah, sounds a lot cheaper.
It sure is.
Cheaper
than the testing lab. He also in the book gives instructions on how to make concrete pigment. His quote is, make a fine purple color by treating bilberry and mixing it with milk and cement. So he's creating purple concrete with use of natural pigmenting materials. And then my favorite quote from De Architectura, Book 2, from Vitruvius is, he says, for neither talent without instruction, nor instruction without talent, can produce the perfect craftsman. So he's talking about employee training, developing next generation employees. So you got to recognize raw talent, but you can't just cut them loose on their own, sink or swim. You got to invest training into to develop this person, and you also got to recognize the talent itself. But I think that's interesting. He's telling them how to do that. And then we'll skip around in history a little bit, but you know the Da Vinci drawing called the Vitruvian Man. It's a picture of a man that Leonardo da Vinci drew, where the man's standing with his arms and legs in one position, but it also shows him in another position. It's famous. Da Vinci. We put it on the side of the Voyager space probe and sent it into space in case anyone from another planet ever found it. They'd know what humans look like. What Da Vinci is illustrating there is he's reading Vitruvius's manual on concrete, and Vitruvius is describing how concrete construction is based on the movement of the human body. So Da Vinci actually illustrates this based on a description of concrete construction. And there's some writing above and below that Da Vinci image, and he's copying a Vitruvian concrete mix design. So that Vitruvian Man image we associate with what it is to be human is actually an illustration of concrete.
Huh.
And how it relates to the human body. I told you we'd skip around a little bit. Let's skip over to the Americas. We often accredit Romans with inventing pozzolans and inventing concrete, but 900 BC. So now we're looking at about 500 years before the Romans start using pozzolan cements to make concrete. The Mayans did. The Mayans made pozzolanic concrete materials very similar to the recipe the Romans were using in the Yucatan Peninsula. There's a city called El Tajín in Mexico now, in the Yucatan, that has pozzolan concrete from 9,000 BC. The Mayans, I can't pronounce this Mayan language cities, but the Mayans, in some of their cities in the Yucatan, in the 7th century, they built the world's longest concrete bridge. And it remained the longest concrete bridge in the world until the Italians built one longer in the 14th century. So for 700 years, the longest bridge in the world was in the Yucatan Peninsula at a Mayan city. And everything in this Mayan city was concrete. The large pyramids, the housing, everything was. What's interesting, though, is for Mayans to make cement, it took about 9 acres of forest to fuel 1 ton of cement. It wasn't very long before they completely deforested their whole region, making this concrete city. And then the rain washed away and eroded the soil, and it killed their crops. So with crop failure, there was no way to support the inhabitants of this beautiful concrete city, and they abandoned it. That's why we have such great ruins now, because it literally lay there abandoned in the middle of constructing it. And it was all because they took zero consideration on how concrete construction affected the natural world around them. They should have been thinking about sustainability of their civilization, and they disregarded sustainability to focus just on rapid concrete construction, and their civilization failed because of that.
Huh. So they were cutting down the trees and using it for what now?
To fuel the burning of cement. So they had a cement kiln, but it took about 9 acres of trees, the type of trees that grew in the Yucatan, in order to fuel just 1 ton of cement. So they totally deforested their area. What's interesting about the Mayans is they viewed cement kilns as feminine, and there was a female goddess that watched over cement kilns. And if any Mayan women got near the kiln would break and stop working because the goddess was jealous of the other women. So they had a no women allowed in the concrete industry, the Mayans did. Sometimes when I look around, I think we haven't got too much farther.
No, we have not. Huh.
So there we are, a world away, another civilization just before the Romans developing the same technology at the same time without communicating with each other. Now, back in Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, we generally regard it as another concrete dark age. We see very little concrete construction. There is still some, though. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry II, actually builds about 100 and some concrete structures at 63 different religious sites all over Central Europe. But he's the Holy Roman Emperor is the only one building out of concrete. So it is kind of a concrete dark ages. Though what's interesting is they've discovered remnants of old mixers, and they're wooden timber structures with pits dug in the ground and timbers built over them. And it's like a machine, and you would strap a few donkeys or even people to this wheel system, and they would walk around in circles, and then cement and sand and small pebbles would be thrown into the pit, and it would mix concrete. It works a lot like a pan mixer would in a precast plant now, just human power instead of machinery, which I think is extremely interesting. And then they would use buckets to retract that concrete and then pack it into place. You're looking at zero slump concrete at the time.
Huh.
But it's mostly is a dark age. But then we find the resurgence of modern concrete starts at this one instance. There's 50 miles south of England, out in the ocean, there's a set of rocks called the Eddystone Rocks. And these gnarly stones that stick up just feet above the ocean level. There's hundreds of shipwrecks there from the English. Thousands of sailors died on these rocks. But then they decide we need to put up a lighthouse to protect the British Navy returning home. So they built a lighthouse out of wood and coat it with tar, and then light a flame as the light in the lighthouse. And just a couple years after it's up, it burns down. So they go out and they build a stacked stone lighthouse on the same rocks. And a large wave hits the stacked stone lighthouse and knocks it into the ocean. And then they go back and build a steel beam lighthouse. And it was up about 15 years. But a hurricane comes through, knocks down the steel beam lighthouse. So Queen Victoria at the time comes to someone who she trusts very much in building, John Smeaton. In fact, we think John Smeaton is the father of modern civil engineering. He was the first person to ever be called a civil engineer. But Queen Victoria puts him on the project. He creates a lighthouse out of interlocking stones and the gaps filled with concrete, Roman concrete. It actually repeats the Roman design of concrete. And this becomes extremely successful. The lighthouse is there for 100 and some years in usage. It was such a popular thing for the English to have conquered the sea that when Queen Victoria had her Jubilee coin made, right, the sterling coin, the only thing on it is Queen Victoria's, it's a profile, and then right behind her is the Smeaton Lighthouse on Eddystone Rock. It was such a part of the British identity, this concrete lighthouse, because it's how they had conquered the natural sea. But the only reason it came down, they did take it down. The rock that it was built on started wearing away. Not the concrete lighthouse, but the stone itself started wearing away. So they took that lighthouse down, moved it to the mainland, re-erected it. You could tour it today. It's still there. Then they built a new lighthouse in this place, which of course is modern concrete.
Wow.
But that launches the modern industry.
What was the fellow's name? John
Smeaton, Smeaton. John Smeaton's a father of civil engineering.
I guess I probably, if I was paying attention in school, they probably mentioned him before. If I went to school for engineering.
Yeah, maybe once. We could come to the U.S. What's interesting is a lot of people in England are developing cement products and concrete products. There's a guy in Scotland, a Scottish engineer, named John McAdam, and he develops a system where he's putting large stones on a roadway, then putting quicklime cement, kind of Roman cement over top of that, and then smaller pebbles on top, and letting the rainwater harden it into a concrete roadway. No one in England, no one in Scotland wants anything to do with it. But, they were all Freemasons. The Freemason George Washington, after his presidency, visiting Scotland, meets McAdam and loves the system, brings him back to the U.S., and has John McAdam put down miles and miles of turnpike road in Maryland and Northern Virginia out of this concrete system. In fact, his name is synonymous with paving in some parts of the United States. If you're from Pennsylvania or spend any time in southern New Jersey or Maryland, a lot of people there still call pavement macadam. Instead of saying the asphalt or the pavement, they'll say it's macadam, and that's where it comes from, is John Macadam. His systems come in handy during the Civil War for the Confederacy. Stonewall Jackson is famous for outmaneuvering much larger Northern armies, and one of the ways he's able to do it is he knew where the macadamized concrete roads were in Northern Virginia, and the Union armies coming down were marching through mud to try and catch them. So he was outmaneuvering them for a year. But let's skip back to England. In 1824, the first patent for Portland cement is taken out. That's Joseph Aspdin. Joseph Aspdin invents Portland cement in his kitchen in his home. 1824 gets the patent. He names it Portland cement because at the time, the most prominent building material, garnering the most attention as a luxury building material at the time, was these limestone rocks quarried at the Isle of Portland in England. So his stones have nothing, or his concrete mixture has nothing to do with that. He's just garnering the name. So it's our industry's first marketing scheme to name our cement Portland cement after something else that's more famous. But what I think is interesting about him is he was arrested 3 times developing Portland cement. And if you look at the arrest records from the time, they all say the same thing. He was arrested for pilfering dust from public turnpikes. What he was doing is he was going out to the limestone, cobblestone streets, and he was taking a hammer and busting it up and collecting small particles from the road. And he kept getting arrested for doing it, and he'd go back out and still do it. But it gave us Portland cement, so I guess I'm glad he stuck to it.
Huh.
And didn't serve too much time in jail. So he invents Portland cement, but his son, William Aspdin, commercializes it. He builds the first commercial kilns, and they're not like kilns we have today. They look a lot more like clay pottery kilns, but on a large scale. Some of them are still standing on cement sites in England now. He was an unscrupulous businessman. He had a lot of crooked practices and was constantly in trouble with the law. And he also did things to throw people off his trail by how he was doing it. When he would load a bunch of materials into a kiln, before he would fire the kiln, he would go out there with a bunch of colored glass beads like they're crystals, and he kept them in a little satchel around his neck, and he would sprinkle them in the kiln because anyone watching, he wanted them to think there was some secret magic ingredient that they couldn't figure out. And it was funny. The Aspens were sketchy people, but that's the birth of Portland cement.
The Aspen family.
That's right. Some of my favorite characters in there. But if you look at the Wikipedia for William Aspdin, some of the things that he managed to get away with and stay out of prison for is pretty funny. So how do we become systematic with the concrete industry? Well, we let the Germans get involved. So in 1836, the German Cement Association forms, and the first thing they do is write a specification. So now in the U.S., we go by ASTM C-150 or 1157. These ASTM standards. The first standard on cement was in 1836 in Germany by the German Cement Association. Also that same year, they standardized a systematic testing of compressive strength. So they invented a system of basically a 6-inch cube that you would break in a compression machine. And so since 1830s, concrete's been systematically tested for compressive strength. It's the most tested material in the world. No material's ever been tested as much as concrete compressive strength has been tested, or as early.
All right, Concrete Logic podcast listeners, this was the spot where I thought it was good to pause my conversation with Paul Ramsburg. You'll need to tune in next week to hear the remainder of the history of concrete. It is a good one, so tune in next week, and you'll hear more from Paul. Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Concrete Logic podcast. If you like what you heard and you think others would get some kind of value out of this podcast, please share it with them. If you have any ideas or topics that you'd like us to discuss on the Concrete Logic podcast, you can email me at seth@concretelogicpodcast.com or hit me up on LinkedIn. Pretty active there. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. you.